Welcome back. Well, the plan itself isn't a new one. President Bush and Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki signed a declaration of principles some 2 months ago, covering a wide range of bilateral issues. But Iraqis themselves are divided. Even those in the government disagree. Sunni and Shia politicians have criticised the plan, saying it would lead to long-term interference in Iraq's affairs. For their part, the followers of radical Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr have repeatedly demanded a timetable for the withdrawal of US troops, while the Association of Muslim Scholars, a Sunni group, has warned they would consider any Iraqi who signs the deal to be collaborating with the occupier. Well, let's rejoin our guests now in London. Hassan Atiyah, Director of the Centre for Iraqi Studies. In Washington, D.C., PHYLLIS BENNIS from the Institute for Policy Studies. And here in Doha, Scott Bates, Vice President of the Centre for National Policy. Hassan Atiyah in London, this is or could be a wide-ranging agreement that will impact on how Iraq is run for years to come. But I want to pick you up on a point you made earlier. Shouldn't Iraqis be deciding their own fate?
Actually, the Iraqis are so divided today, and they are using the American as a leverage against each other. The Kurd would welcome a Kurd American base in Kurdistan because that would serve their interests against Turkey and others. But the Americans are very suspicious of having a base in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Similarly, some of the Islamists will see an American presence allied with them will give them stronger hand and using the American actually to finish their opposition, namely scary, that is the Islamic Council, the Shia Islamic Council will rely on the American to fight Muqtada al-Sadr and his group, and they are actually using the American to do their dirty job. In this sense, on the other hand, the Sunni and the Shia are also against this because they feel that the America are not impartial, but actually they are taking side with the Al-Hakim group and with the Kurdish leadership, and they are not happy with this. In this sense, the Iraqi, in addition to their history, the history of Iraqi relation with Britain in the past, they will always be suspicious of such a deal. Accordingly, I would say this agreement will be very difficult to pass. It will be a source of contention, and I would expect whoever will sign it will have really difficult job passing it in the parliament.
It's an interesting point you make about the political divisions. I want to put that to Scott Bates here in Doha. How much do you think, Scott, the success of this deal will be determined by political consensus inside Iraq? I mean, could this pact become unravelled if there isn't political reconciliation by the government, across the government?
Well, I think that deadlines focus the mind, and the UN resolution expires on December 31st. And after that, there's no legal authority for the United States to be in Iraq. So really, there needs to be an agreement by December 31st, one way or the other. And one would hope, for the sake of Iraq and the United States and its troops there, that there'd be some kind of understanding, some limits put on what the relationship's going to be. This is in the interest of everyone. And, you know, if it isn't forthcoming, I don't see it with the Bush administration, but I hope they'd consider just saying, all right, we're going to start withdrawing troops pretty quickly unless we reach some kind of agreement. And that might focus their minds very quickly.
PHYLLIS BENNIS in Washington, US officials are saying that they're also trying to seek economic agreement in this pact. It's not just about security. Does this play into the hands of those critics who say this is all about oil and possibly protecting the huge profits that US oil companies will be reaping within the Iraqi oil deal?
Well, there's no doubt that the tentative agreement that was signed by Prime Minister Maliki and President Bush does make the protection of U.S. control of Iraqi oil a very central component. There's no doubt about it. It specifies that the U.S. will have a privileged position in its investments in Iraq. So that part is very clear. I think that the more important part, which Hassan referred to as well, is the issue of legitimacy of any such pact. The oil laws that the U.S. is trying to impose, and certainly this military agreement, is being done without parliamentary involvement, despite the fact that I think it was 139 members of parliament signed a letter before the issue came to the United Nations Security Council to extend the mandate, saying we don't want the mandate to be extended without a full timetable to be included. That was ignored. Similarly, when the Bush-Maliki agreement was signed, the Parliament again, I think this time it was 144 members, signed a letter saying we must be consulted and that any such agreement, according to the Iraqi Parliament, this was something that came up in the hearings held in Congress by Congressman Bill Delahunt of Massachusetts with experts on the Iraqi Constitution, who indicated very clearly that the Constitution requires parliamentary agreement not only for formal treaties, but also for agreements. This is clearly an agreement, and yet Maliki has gone around the parliament. There are issues of legitimacy not only of the government itself, but also of the parliament. But certainly the parliament has far more legitimacy than the very, very narrow government that is kept in power by the U.S. occupation itself. So the issue of legitimacy of any of these components of the agreement is very much at risk.
Well, let's put that point to Ghassan Ati in London. I mean, there's a point you raised earlier on that Iraq perhaps should hold early elections and form a new, stronger parliament. Would they be in a stronger position to negotiate if that happened? And is that how you see it?
The question is, I really cannot understand the American administration stand, and they're insisting on rushing this. As far as the legal point that the agreement with the UN will end in next July, that's fine. Actually, that's simply getting Iraq out of Chapter 7. This is a good move. But on the other hand, they could this agreement in a very clear, like all other forces, to give a new mandate to the American and international forces in Iraq, but not under Chapter 7, but exactly the way they were sent in Africa or in other regions. That will be an improvement, because the fact the relation of the Iraqi will be with the UN, then Iraq at any time in the future could simply say that's the end of it and finish with it. But by insisting that it will replace the American administration or the American government, to replace the UN by the American, this will make the Iraqi feel very suspicious, and they feel that there are other desires behind it. In addition to this, if I may add, the question of Iran. Now, we know very well that Iran is very influential in Iraq and could destabilize Iraq. Having such forces or such a relation or a treaty, if it will be construed by the Iranian as a threat to them, they will have all the means and ways to make life in Iraq more difficult, and thus the trouble will continue in Iraq.
All right, let's bring in back Scott Bates here, because Iraq's National Security Advisor, Muwafaq al-Rubai, says Iraq will not accept any permanent US bases on its soil. Could this be a major problem for future Iraqi-US relations, do you think?
You know, I don't think so, because politically within the United States, there's not a lot of will to come out and say we're going to have permanent bases. But, you know, what is permanent after all? I mean, is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is that permanent? I'm guessing the Bush administration would say no. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. And really, American success is going to be judged by the speed at which our troops can withdraw and the Iraqi government can be stabilized. So a permanent presence, unlike in South Korea, where it was keeping a status quo situation, status quo is not acceptable in Iraq right now. The U.S. actually does aim to leave at a certain point when Iraq can stand up on its own.
PHYLLIS Bennis in Washington. All right, so deal or no deal, I mean, how do you see the future of US-Iraqi relations playing out, particularly with a new US president on the horizon in a few months' time?
Unfortunately, I don't think that the possibilities of a serious change are enough, even with a new administration. The Democratic candidates are very clear that they would have a very different strategy towards war in Iraq, but none of them are calling for an actual end to the war in Iraq. Their criticism is that the Bush administration has done it badly, that they've had too many troops or too few troops. But they have not said that the war was wrong, that it was illegal from the beginning, and therefore it remains illegal as an occupation. So I think that there's going to be a continued struggle in the United States, because so far we're not seeing either in Congress or among the mainstream candidates a commitment to take the position that the majority of the American people have asked for, and that is a full and complete end to the war by either immediately or by 1 year. That means withdrawal of all troops, not keeping 10 or 20 or 50 or 70,000 in place for training or counterinsurgency or something else. It will not include these large numbers of permanent bases, which, whatever you call them, these are essentially, 5 of them at least, are like small towns of the United States with 7-mile-long perimeters. They are so large that some of them take 2 bus lines to crisscross these bases, one of them being built right up against the Iranian border. Now, how much more provocative could it be than an American base right against an Iranian border? So, you know, all of these issues have yet to be seriously taken up, I think, even in the election context, where we hear a great many words, we hear a great deal about we must bring the troops home, but when we parse that just a little bit, we hear only some of the troops and at some point.
Okay, we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. PHYLLIS BENNIS in Washington, Scott Bates in Doha, and Hassan Latia in London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. That's insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now and thanks for watching.